Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking some of the most profound, literally world-shaping ideas of the 20th century. We're going to be diving deep into postcolonialism and the absolutely groundbreaking work of Frantz Fanon. So let's just jump right in and break these complex theories down.
Right. And to do that properly, we are pulling directly from some fantastic, rigorous academic material prepared by the Department of English at the Odisha State Open University. Their unit on colonial encounters and postcolonial perspectives is basically the bedrock for everything we're about to talk about today.
Okay, so think about places like the Caribbean, Africa, or India, nations that spent a long time under the thumb of massive imperial forces like Britain and France. The big central question we have to ask is, what actually happens to a culture's identity after the colonizers pack up and leave? How do these nations deal with the really deep, lingering imprints left on their societies?
Well, that right there is the defining question of post-colonial theory. And to understand it, we have to start with the concept of otherness. Basically, this was the psychological and cultural tactic where colonizing powers defined the people they were ruling as fundamentally different, inferior or just totally outside the bounds of civilization. Colonial literature used this idea of otherness constantly. It was a way to strip colonized people of their agency and their culture, framing them as the other, so the empire could intellectually and, I guess morally, justify all the violence they were committing.
That makes total sense. But how did they keep that illusion going on such a massive global scale? They leaned heavily on what theorist Abdul Jan Muhammad calls the Manichaean allegory. It's essentially this incredibly destructive, rigid binary worldview. The colonizers set up a system where the West was always framed as rational, masculine, and inherently good. And the colonized world, often lumped together as the Orient, was painted as chaotic, feminine, and evil. It wasn't just a casual stereotype, right? It was a structural tool. By making the colonized look chaotic, the empire gets to swoop in and play the hero, the necessary force of order and reason.
Right, so we see how they controlled the politics and the culture. But what about the internal damage? How does being constantly told you are the other actually mess with the human mind over generations?
To really get into that, we have to talk about Frantz Fanon. He's an absolute giant in this field. Born in 1925 in Martinique, which was a French colony in the Caribbean, Fanon's whole life was just saturated in the contradictions of empire. He literally fought for the French army in World War II, but was still treated like a second-class citizen. After the war, he studied psychiatry in France, and by 1953, he's running the psychiatry department at a hospital in Algeria, right during brutal French colonial rule. So you have this brilliant guy with first-hand experience of systemic racism, who's also medically treating the extreme trauma of the Algerian people. He was just perfectly positioned to figure out the psychological wreckage of colonization.
Wow. So what did he actually discover while he was treating these patients? Well, his discoveries turned into his iconic 1952 book, Black Skin, White Masks. Fanon found that colonized people actually begin to internalize their own supposed inferiority. Because the colonizer's culture is shoved down their throats as the only civilized way to be, the colonized person tries to adopt the oppressor's identity. They're forced to put on these psychological white masks, speaking the language, dressing the part, adopting the values, just to be treated like human beings. But the tragic part, it never actually gets them equality. It just leads to a fractured sense of self, total alienation, and really deep trauma.
That is incredibly heavy. And this idea of immense trauma really sets the stage for his later super controversial work, The Wretched of the Earth, where he basically says that colonialism dehumanizes everybody involved, both the colonized and the colonizer.
Exactly. Drawing from his time in the Algerian liberation movement, Fanon argued that the whole colonial system is just violently rotten at its core. And this shocked a lot of people back then, but he claimed that violence from the oppressed could actually be a necessary step to reclaim their dignity and agency. For him, liberation wasn't just signing a peace treaty. It meant completely tearing down the social structures and transforming the human mind.
But wait, does getting political independence actually fix the root problem? When the colonizers physically pack up, is the fight over?
Oh, not even close. Fanon was really vocal about the dangers of what he called neocolonialism. That's when a former colony gets independence on paper, sure, but they are still completely tied down economically and culturally by their old bosses, or maybe by new global superpowers. The real tragedy here, as Fanon saw it, was that the newly empowered local elites often just step right into the colonizers' shoes. Instead of fixing the system for everyday people, they just copy the exact same exploitation to get rich while everyone else keeps suffering.
So Fanon really laid down this incredible foundation centered on physical and psychological resistance. But how did these ideas actually evolve in the academic world after he passed away?
Well, the whole field matured a lot as new thinkers stepped up. You've got Fanon building the psychological base in the 50s and 60s. Then, moving into the 1970s, the focus pivots more toward literature and culture, with theorists like Edward Said. And by the 1990s, folks like Homi K. Bhabha and Gayatri Spivak are pushing things even further, looking at language, hybrid cultures, and making sure the most silenced voices were finally being heard.
Let's zoom in on that shift in the 70s. What was Edward Said's big contribution here? Said dropped a total bombshell of a book in 1978 called Orientalism. He argued that the West historically invented this idea of the Orient, the East, as this exotic, backwards, entirely subordinate place. Said built on Michel Foucault's ideas about how knowledge and power are locked together. He showed that all those romantic or savage depictions of the East in European art and science, they weren't just innocent creative choices. They were deliberate tools of empire, designed to make Western domination look totally natural and justified.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about this stark contrast, colonizer versus colonized. But is postcolonial identity really just this straightforward clash of two completely separate opposing cultures?
Actually, no. And this is where Homi K. Bhabha comes in to say, hey, it's way more complicated than a simple binary. He points out that when the colonizer tries to force their norms on people, the colonized often respond with what he calls mimicry. They imitate the colonizer, but it's, as Bhabha puts it, almost the same, but not quite. And that tiny bit of distortion creates massive anxiety for the colonizers because it kind of makes a mockery of their authority. Ultimately, this weird friction gives birth to a third space. It's this fluid area of cultural hybridity where brand new identities emerge. Identities that aren't fully Western or fully Eastern, but something entirely new.
Okay, so Fanon, Said, and Bhabha give us the psychology, the literature, and the hybridity of it all. But we have to stop and ask, who is still being completely left out of this conversation? Where is the blind spot here?
That is the million-dollar question, and it brings us to Gayatri Spivak in her concept of the subaltern. She borrowed the term from the philosopher Antonio Gramsci, and it refers to the people who are totally marginalized and silenced by the power structures in place. In her highly influential essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, Spivak absolutely roasts Western intellectuals. She argues that even the academics with the best intentions often try to speak for oppressed people. And the irony is, by trying to be their voice, the intellectual just silences the subaltern even more, basically projecting their own academic biases onto the people they're claiming to help.
So how does Spivak actually apply that critique today? She takes a super intersectional approach. She focuses a lot on rural women in the global South, because they are routinely ignored by both the old colonial systems and traditional patriarchy. She calls out Western feminism for trying to parachute in and impose its own version of liberation onto these women, totally ignoring their local day-to-day realities. Plus, she warns that modern global capitalism loves to hide its exploitation of post-colonial nations behind words like development. For Spivak, real empowerment doesn't come from some Western savior, it comes from localized critical education.
It is honestly fascinating how all these theories just interlock to explain the messy reality of the world we live in today.
For sure. And if you take away just one thing from the Odisha State Open University's curriculum here, it's that literature is a double-edged sword. It has absolutely been used to oppress and other marginalized groups, but at the same time, storytelling is this insanely powerful tool for resistance. Today, post-colonial writers are using literature to take back their own narratives, figure out their hybrid identities, and really start healing from centuries of historical trauma.
Which leaves us with one final, really provocative question for you to chew on. Think about the media we consume, the political structures we live under, the history books we read. If our modern world was shaped by these colonial narratives of the past, what masks are we all still wearing today? And more importantly, how do we finally take them off? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll catch you next time.